The first thing we are going to do is to print this test page. This is the first page we are going to work on for this dress. We have to check our printer settings because the scale for this pattern is 100. This little ruler is 6 inches long, and since I'm European I use centimeters, so 6 inches is about 15 and 2 centimeters. So we take our ruler and we can see this little ruler is exactly 15 centimeters and 2, so the scale is correct. Okay, at this point we can print our e-pattern and start to assembling the various pieces. As you can see, there are several pages for this pattern. Is not a huge pattern, but it requires a lot of space. So we start assembling the pieces. We just have to follow diagrams and directions. It's really easy. Now I'm not going to show you how to assemble the whole pattern because it's really easy, and you can use a regular tape to keep in place the various papers. After doing all the work about assembling the pattern pages, we're going to trace our sides using a very sheer piece of paper. Personally, I like to trace my own patterns instead of cutting them because, especially when you're working on multiple sizes with clients, it's better to keep your pattern pieces sane and avoiding to cutting them, because cutting can bring to lose your pattern pieces. So using a very fine piece of paper, Swedish tracing paper is good for that. You trace the size you're going to use. For example, for this dress I'm going to use size 10. So I put my piece of paper here and gonna trace my pattern. When tracing your patterns, it's really important to trace your marks. These marks are really important because they could be used as guide. For example, these are notches and they really helpful when assembling two fabric pieces together because they really are guide. So we draw notches, 3 notches here, and this arrow is the fold of your fabric. So we are going to cut these pieces. It is actually the back of our bodice. We are going to cut it on the fold of your fabric. These are 2 pattern pieces I traced on paper. This is actually the back of bodice and the side back. As you can see, the notches match perfectly. And these signs will be our guide in assembling this curve. This little arrow is the grain of your fabric, so this means we are going to cut our fabric on the grain, so on the stray. At this point I proceeded to cut the pieces for my lining. I'm using a very sheer cotton for my lining, and this is the front lining of our bodice. This is a very strange shape because these 2 pieces have to cross over and like this, and they have to be pinned together here and obviously here. It's very clear when the pieces are set on your dress form or on your body if you don't have a dress form. I already did a very narrow hem along the edges, including the bottom. This pattern has a very is really rich in instructions and illustration. But at first, especially if you're not used to historical costume, especially Regency, you can get a little bit confused about the way to assemble this dress, because this lining is not made as a normal lining, because just the front pieces of your bodies will be covered by the lining. So we're going to sew the lining just on the side seams. So here I already made a little seam, then I ripped it off to show you where we're going to attach the lining to the bodies. And same for shoulders. Now I'm going to cut the back, side and front pieces of our bodies. As a fashion fabric, I used this very sheer red cotton fabric from IKEA. So this is our back, our side back pieces, and the front pieces, which will be, when worn, wrapped around the bust. As you can see, I still haven't trimmed my seams. I'm going to sew them using a French seam. This is the front of our bodies. I did a row of gathering stitches on the shoulder, and at the bottom of my bodies the pattern calls for pleats, but I decided to use gathers because in my opinion they're really closer to Regency style. So like this I will have a very smooth and a very generous bust shape. After gathering the bodies, I stitched shoulder seams and bodice seams using a French seam. Then I pinned the lining into the armhole to keep it in place. This is the gather in the shoulder seam. To encase all the raw edges of the bodice, I made some strips of self-fabric bias tape, using one of the pattern piece as guide, using a chalk and a ruler. As you can see, I made a lot of strips using a single scrap of fabric. I'm going to make my own bias tape instead of using a pre-made one, using this tool, scissors or cutter, and my iron.